Hello and welcome to this Gratiaen Pod. My name is Dr. Sanjana Hattotuwa. I'm very, very happy to be speaking with Dr. Anthony Joseph today, who is the chief juror of this year's Gratiaen Trust and has been very kindly supported in his journey to Sri Lanka by the British Council. Anthony, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
It's been, at the time of recording this, a couple of days in the country, and the Gratiaens have been awarded, and you were the chief juror. Is it your first time in the country?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And how have you been enjoying it? At the time of recording, we are inundated with rain.
I think for any visit to any city that I make, it takes a couple of days to sort of acclimatize and mentally as well. And I think I'm now beginning to feel really comfortable and really like, okay, I'm cool. At first, when I first came in, it was quite overwhelming. The heat, the busyness, the traffic.
You're from Trinidad.
I'm from Trinidad, yeah, but I live in London, right? I've lived in London for a long time. So coming to any sort of city like Colombo is, you can't, it's like meeting someone for the first time. You can't expect to know everything about them straight away. You got to take your time and enter it slowly, So yeah, I've been here since Friday, and yeah, it's been amazing.
Well, welcome. Let's dive right into it. You are here for the Gratiaens, and one of the things that you have, I would imagine, to do is to read Sri Lankan literature.
Yeah.
One of the things that interested me so much about your oeuvre and your output is that it reminded me of the person who started the Gratiaen, Michael Ondaatje, and what he wrote in 1976, about 2 decades prior to the English Patient, which won the Booker. I wonder, have you read Coming Through Slaughter?
Of course, yeah.
That's amazing, right? I mean, it kind of prefaced your work. It's jazz in a novel. It's for me a really unique piece of English literature from Sri Lanka.
Absolutely.
Or from an author of Sri Lankan origin. In your experience of engagement either with the Gratiaens this year or even prior to it, what's your take on Sri Lankan literature, contemporary Sri Lankan fiction and literature, and what you've read from this country in your line of work?
Well, I mean, I can only really speak about the entries that I read for the Gratiaens.
For the Gratiaens this year, yes, indeed.
Prior to this, I couldn't say that I had besides Michael Ondaatje, I didn't really have a real sort of understanding or context for Sri Lankan literature. So it was real fortunate to be able to read so much, in such a short space of time and to be immersed in it. What did I think? I mean, I think that there's clearly a lot of passion and a lot of talent, and there's a lot of similarity between Sri Lankan writing and writing from the Caribbean. There's a lot of the themes that are quite similar. The struggle for a distinctive identity. I think a lot of the books that I read were trying to define what it means to be Sri Lankan or what Sri Lanka means, And you find that in a lot of Caribbean literature, even now, after, post-colonialism is passé now, but, a lot of writers from the Caribbean are still trying to define what it means to be a Caribbean person. And I still see that here in a lot of the fiction. There's another sort of similarity which deals with, I think, detail, the sensory detail in the work. So I was really struck by how a lot of fiction writers especially were really invested in describing the landscape, the flowers, the smells, in a really sort of, like if they became characters in themselves, And that's a very similar thing to Trinidadian literature, because I think it's the vibrancy and the heat and the everything, the sort of combination of colors and everything. You can't help but write about it, So there's that similarity. I think it's still, there's a lot of the writers still need a lot of development and mentoring to sort of get the work up to a standard. I mean, we can talk about that later, but just to be brief, that's what I thought, that it's at a stage where they need a little bit more support, so the technical support and maybe exposure to other types of literature to see what's possible.
Your own output has been influenced by, amongst other things, Calypso jazz and surrealism. And I quote in one interview you had done, "Over the years, I have realized that being a poet means that you have a particular outlook, a particular way of looking at language and seeing the world in a language-based way.
Yeah.
You are trying to find a new way every time of explaining what it means to be human."
Yes.
Now, my point is a very specific question out of that. Of all the forms that if you do a Google search on you, you are seemingly an incredible virtuoso in. What is it about poetry that is the distillation of all of those forms that you have taken in, that for you speaks to what you try as an endeavor to have that language about a critique of humanity?
I think there's lots of questions in that one question. But, you know, for me, poetry is an umbrella term for a lot of different practices, for a lot of different ways of looking at the world. For me, I'm always trying to ask myself, how do I say this in a way that hasn't been said before? How do I say this in a way that's beautiful? And invariably, that turns to music, and the musicality of the thing. You know, Walter Pater, who's an English critic, Victorian critic, said that all art aspires to the condition of music. And that has been something that I've followed, and I think it's accurate. So that you're trying, I'm trying all the time to write something or to perform in a way or to speak about something that feels immediate. Like you know, like water. That is, it's, you know, like music. It's immediate, you know. So I'm trying to do something like that to sort of cut out the interface between the product and the audience, you know, and go directly to the person. The way you do that is by being human. It's by being real. It's by being honest, you know. When you perform, I mean, we're kind of ranging around a lot of things, but when I perform with my band or whatever, that's kind of almost a spiritual practice, because at that time, you are in the moment and you can't pause and rewind, or you can't say, hang on a sec, let me do that again. You're with the audience and you're one-on-one and you're doing your thing, and you have to be yourself. If you're pretensive and being something else, the audience sees right through you, you know. So that's really interesting. And then when you write, you do have the ability to pause and craft and all that. So there's something about those two worlds that I think is human, you know, the fact that we can be reflective, but we can also be immediate. So I don't know if that...
Well, it's a beautiful answer.
It goes away to answering it.
It was a kind of an entry point into, I don't know whether the camera captures this, but Sonnets for Albert, which is the TS Eliot Prize winning collection of poetry.
Yeah.
I'm very pleased. You know, it's quite interesting that the Gratiaen very kindly provided me this book. It really moved me. I lost my father in 2019. And so in a very different way to, I think, your endeavor to recall and remember and memorialize your father, as for many of us who've lost a father, this spoke to us, or spoke to me, very profoundly. And I thank you for that. The whole collection is about an absent father, and you grappling with this complicated tryst, in a sense, with memory and love and absence,
Absolutely.
and this parent who is present but invisible, physically not there but clearly in your heart.
Absolutely.
How did the manifestation of this collection help you remember and maybe come closer to your father after his passing?
Well, you know, my father has been a muse for me for many years, you know. I didn't start writing about him when he passed, you know. I'd been writing about him for my whole writing life, almost, you know. He was a very enigmatic, charismatic, but quite mysterious person, you know. So I was fascinated by him for many years, you know. When I was a child, I was fascinated by him because he wasn't around, and he was this mythical figure that would turn up once in a while. And always be very, you know, well-dressed and slick and the life of the party. And I was fascinated by him. So the writing about him started, as soon as I started writing poetry, I was like trying to understand, you know, poetry for me has been a way of understanding the world, you know. Because I grew up with my grandparents, I was quite a shy, introverted child. So writing for me was a way of understanding the world through language. And part of that was writing about my father and writing about my mother, because I didn't live with them. So I was trying to understand them. But I don't see the writing about him as therapy or anything, because I feel like it's a culmination of a lot of things, rather than I'm writing this book to clear some sort of, to use it for some sort of therapy, to understand my father. No, I understand him. I know what he's about. And the book was kind of a way of putting everything I had about him, or felt about him, or knew, or remembered about him in one place, so that I could say, okay, I kind of understand who he is now, and here, this is what he is. Because a lot of the memories I had of him were brief and scattered. And since he wasn't this constant presence, I needed something that had a sense of constancy. When he passed, I needed to say, okay, I understand who this man was to a certain extent, as much as you could understand anyone. And he's inside of this book. He's in here. I've captured him. And it was, the question is, a lot of people have asked as well, how do you write about someone like that who is a terrible father? He wasn't a great father. He was an interesting man, but he wasn't a great father. So the book was an exercise in love as well. How do you love someone that is not doing what they should be doing as a father? So I had to grapple with that and find the love, find what I loved in him and what that love was. So that was interesting. That was a real process of growth, maturity. Yeah.
Was it there in the early writing that kind of evolved into the work that made it in this book? You said you had been writing about him when he was alive as well.
No, I think all that stuff that I've wrote before is scattered in different collections and things.
Yeah.
But this, I started writing this when he passed.
Yeah.
I started writing it when he died. And I just started writing. I started writing it as a crown of sonnets. I wanted to write a crown of sonnets for him. And then I abandoned that whole idea because I just needed a little bit more space and freedom. And I just wrote a series of sonnets in the months after he passed. Yeah.
Can you, if you will indulge us, read no, I think I have it
Okay.
here. It's called Breakfast in DC.
Yeah.
And for those who are looking at this, it's on page 72 of the collection.
Yeah. So this actually is a good poem to read, because this was at a point in the mid-2000s, way before my dad had passed, when I was in Washington for a conference at Howard. And I started thinking then about the relationship between my own creativity and my own poetry and the sense of an absent father, having an absent father, and whether or not that influenced the work. Breakfast in DC. That night after the conference in DC, we broke free of post-colonial tautology to gather in the small room of the writer in residence. We were young scholars, poets, novelists, a journalist. We drank white wine warm and nodded to neo-soul. I saw them recoil from the British resident when, in the marrow dark of 3 a.m., he rightly said that there was nothing like the sweet kick of crack cocaine. At dawn, we drove out in the doctoral candidate's car. We saw the Doric pillars of the Lincoln Memorial glowing in the unclear distance. Then the white gasp of the monument. We ordered pancakes with blueberries at Pete's on 2nd Street and shared our commonalities. And what we shared, besides our blackness, was that in our childhoods, our fathers had all been absent.
How beautiful. How tragic, but also beautiful.
Yeah.
You went to the United Kingdom in 1989, but you're from Trinidad, you're of Trinidad. How has that negotiation of the United Kingdom since '89 as an immigrant shaped what you've gone on to produce?
Well, the UK, and especially London, is kind of part of the Caribbean.
Is it now?
It's part of the Caribbean consciousness.
Is it?
Because we were a colony until 1962.
Yeah.
So the English have been in Trinidad since, gosh, the 18th century, So our education system, when I was going to school in the 70s and in the early 80s, was very much modeled on a British model. So, you know, going to school, I read all the classics, and I read a lot of English literature, as well as a lot of writers, local writers. But coming into England, I mean, Stuart Hall talks about this as well, that you come into England and a lot of it is familiar. And you see things, you see landscapes that are familiar to you from propaganda or whatever, you know, from books, from TV or whatever, from your imagination, but it feels familiar. I had the same feeling when I went to New York for the first time many years ago and saw like yellow cabs and stuff. I was like, this is familiar. Oh yeah, you know, because you've grown up with it, with these images and these ideas. So a lot of the UK was familiar on a visual sort of externalized level. But then the sort of internal process of Britishness and what it means to be in England, that's a different thing. That takes a long time to really get your head around. But you know, what happens for me in the UK, or what's happened, is that I've become more of a Trinidadian as the years have gone on, because I'm holding on to that bit of me that I identify with, you know, that I grew up with. So I'm holding on to the identity, holding on to it. And that's what a lot of writers have said as well, that they become Caribbean in the UK. You know, when I met Kemal Braithwaite for the first time, he said to me, you know, you only become a Caribbean person when you leave the Caribbean. And that's what I found. But I feel more and more of a Trinidadian as the years have gone on, and I have more of an understanding of what it means. And that tension between being a Trinidadian and being in the UK and being in Europe, that tension and that liminal space is where the work comes out of, you know.
Yesterday, as I was preparing for this conversation, I listened at full blast, bless my neighbors, to Swing Praxis.
Oh yeah.
Which I absolutely loved, by the way. You are incredible.
Okay.
You have a great voice, and of course, Kamau is the first number you pay tribute to. You pay tribute to him. I wanna, you know, I was so interested in calling England home that, at least on the site that I went to, and looked at the lyrics, because sometimes your voice is so interesting, you can just listen to it for as music, but the lyrics is what interested me in addition to it. And forgive me for not being as mellifluous as you are. I'm just going to read out this section of that song. And I quote, "I've lived here longer than home since 1989. I was never asked to wait tables or to serve scones and coffee. I worked in the basement. But I learned to tie my apron in a way that retained some dignity. And in my first summer above the corner shop, I listened to rare groove on pirate radio. I was flung so far from any notion of nation. How long do you have to live in a place before you call it home?" My question is, where is home? And I might be reading too much into it, but when you sing it in the stanzas, your stress on home is the most silent. As if you're not sure.
Yeah.
You talk about the 50s, you talk about the Windrush generation, and then the 60s, and then you talk about yourself. And in each stanza, when you sing it, and I really encourage viewers to listen to it, it's a wonderful album, it's a wonderful song, but your stress on home is the most silent. And I found that interesting too. So is that complex for you?
Of course, yeah. The idea of home is, you know, I've grappled with it, and a lot of people have asked, you know, where is home? You know, as someone from Trinidad.
What is home?
Or what is home? I think that we have this might be a little bit against the grain a bit, but we have this idea when you're asked this question that home is a singular place.
Yeah.
That home is, you know, it has to be, where is home? And you want an answer, and the answer is a singular, oh, it's this place, or it's that place. I feel that it's both. I feel that home for me can be two places. I feel completely at home in London now. I have my family there. You know, I've been there. I've been in London since '89, which is longer than I lived in Trinidad. You know, there's so much of my life is tied up there, and I want to be there. And I think a lot of times home is where you want to be. So I'm very comfortable in the UK. But when I go to Trinidad and I'm there for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, I feel this is where I want to be, you know. So this is home as well. So there are two homes, you know. I don't think home has to be this one place, especially for people that are in exile or people that are traveling or living in, people in the diaspora. we get forced to choose one place, and sometimes it's both, you know. Yeah, sometimes it's both, and I think for me it is both. It is both the UK and Trinidad. I mean, in terms of a spiritual home, if that exists, I think it's always going to be Trinidad. I think the place that you gain consciousness in, the place that you arrive at yourself in, is always going to be a sort of spiritual home. And for me, that's Trinidad. You know, in Trinidad that's the place where I breathed life and understood who I was, you know. So that's really important, you know. That's where I come from, you know. So that's home. But, you know, in the real world, home is London, you know. It's the practical life that I live. It's in London, you know. So it's both.
But you don't get the rivers of Trinidad in London.
No, you don't get that.
Yes, you do.
But you get other things.
You
I mean,
get other,
you know.
fair enough. Yeah. You've, and again to quote you, you've said that, and going back to this notion of multiplicity and, you know, multiple geographies and contested notions of home, you've said that Caribbean poets are, quote, the historians and the biographers of the Caribbean people, because so much of history has been stolen, essentially, erased.
Yes.
Do you see it as a responsibility in your writing to bear witness to that which has been taken away and stolen and erased?
Yes, I think you're accurate. I think it's a responsibility.
Yeah.
It's not the only responsibility. But definitely, yeah. And that has become something that I've realized as I've gotten older. You know, at the beginning, I mean, Ernest Hemingway has got this really cool saying where he says, when you first start to write, you get all the kicks. But then later on, the reader gets the kicks. So what he means is that when you first start to write and you're excited about writing, you want to show how great you are as a writer. You're experimental, you're trying all different things, you want to impress, you know, and you get all the kicks. You're like, oh, wow, this is great. But then as you mature, you realize that part of your responsibility as a writer is communication. It's to communicate with the wider world and to be human, you know. And that means trying to reach people and trying to engage with people outside of yourself. So that has become an important part of what I've done, what I do now. And the way to do that, ironically, is to be more personal in the work. So, you know, there's this sort of a conflict. It's not really a conflict. There's this debate between whether an artist's role is to serve the community that they're part of or whether you serve yourself as an artist. I think it's both, and I think as a Caribbean person though, because as you say, and as we know, a lot of that history has been erased. You know, I could only trace my ancestry back to a certain point and stuff like that, and a lot of it is unwritten. The lives of Caribbean people, like my father, is, you know, it's not there. So yes, it is part of my responsibility. Part of it is to memorialize these people and to speak about their lives and to speak about the Caribbean in a very dignified way, you know. That is part of my response. It's not all the responsibility that I also have a responsibility as an artist to write the best work that I can. And that might not be work that serves the community. It might be work that just explores certain degrees of creativity or certain degrees of experimentalism or certain degrees of trying to connect with other writers. You know, like I'm a big fan of African-American writers of a certain period, 60s and 70s. So a lot of the work engages with that as well on an artistic, creative level. But yeah, you know, it's an important thing. I mean, Frantz Fanon talks about it, that as what he calls a native writer goes through a series of processes, a series of stages. And in the first stage, you want to show that you've mastered the language of the colonizer. So you write very experimentally and all that. But after a while, as you go through the stages, in the last stage, you join the people against the oppressor. So you join the people. You become part of the people, you know, and that's kind of where I'm getting to as a writer.
This is just listening to you, it just occurred to me, you've traveled to the United States.
Yeah.
Now, is there a difference in the reception from countries or geographies that were part of the empire through to, say, how an American audience would take to your writing around Trinidad and the experience of colonial violence?
Well, you know, I think this again is an evolving process. You know, when I first started traveling to the U.S. and reading, and a lot of it was exotic for a lot of American readers. They didn't quite understand the Caribbean and, you know, the dynamics of the politics and all of that. But, you know, over the years, I find that their knowledge has increased about the Caribbean. It's just increased a little bit, so that now, you know, if I go to California, I go to New York, people know where Trinidad is. They have a deeper understanding. And that is because we're in a world where communication and information is readily available. And I always said, the world is flat now. We can all see each other.
Perhaps as a final question, you know, we live in a time and an age which is, in a sense, unprecedented. You have technology like generative AI being able to create content, large language models or so-called LLMs being able to kind of ingest, you know, billions and billions of material and then spit out things in the form of fashion of Anthony Joseph. What is it like for you to live through the evolving times that we are now facing as a writer? I mean, you know, technically, one can put all of your output into a large language model and say, spit something out, and it will spit something out that has no soul, but might sound like you. You know, have you thought about it? Is it going to impact what you do and how you do it? And what is it like, actually?
That's, you know, it's fascinating. I mean, I remember years ago reading a book on postmodernism, when postmodernism was a thing. You know? And one of the ideas that was like, what happens after postmodernism? What happens after postmodernism, according to that book, was a kind of post-romanticism where we became obsessed with the body, with health food and consciousness and what it means to be human. And I think it was accurate. I think we're in a point now where humanity or the reality of being a human being, breathing and thinking, is going to become an exotic thing. It's going to become this rare, precious thing that we're going to try to really hold on to, and that is going to become special. It's going to become, I think, that humanity, and I don't know if humanity is the word, but human intelligence is going to become that precious commodity, you know, that we hold on to. And the sort of AI and computers, which were once seen as something really exciting and rich that we needed to hold on to, is going to become the commercialized sphere of our realities. And that, you know, the things that make us human are the things that we're going to really hold on to. They're going to become special. So I could see in a future time where someone that writes an original poem is going to be held up as something quite special and quite precious, and the AI produced work is going to be like, you know, like anything that's mass produced, you know, it's going to be readily available. It's like, you know, gosh, I mean, an analogy is like finding vinyl records. I collect a lot of vinyl records. If I get an original copy of John Coltrane's Love Supreme, that is this beautiful, original, amazing thing. And it's precious and it's expensive. You know, I was in the States, I saw one for $1,000. But I could go to a shop and buy a reissue of it for $10, you know, 10 pounds, but it's not the same thing. You know, it's not the same thing. So I think humanity and consciousness and creativity is going to be like that original John Coltrane album, which we hold on to, and is lifted up as something precious. And everything else is going to be, you can produce it with the touch of a button, you know. And I think that's part of how I see it. But, you know, who knows, man? You know.
Well, I think what a beautiful note to end our conversation on. I would imagine that what you've said, I would like to be the future, you know, as opposed to a syncopated mimicry, that there is something of an Anthony Joseph and the soul and the history and the life that informs our appreciation of our art and literature, which of course the Gratiaen Trust so values and celebrates in Sri Lanka. Anthony, thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
On this Gratiaen Pod.
Thank you so much.